The Kremlin has declined to confirm or deny U.S. reports of a phone call between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Sir, can you tell us about your conversation with Vladimir Putin?
I don't want to do that now. No. We're trying to end that war. It's a war that would have never happened if I were president. It would have never happened. But we're making progress, but I can't tell you.
Do you expect to meet him in person?
Where?
Putin. Do you anticipate meeting with him?
I would imagine I would be meeting with Putin, yes, at the right time. I think at the right time, at the appropriate time.
All right, so we're diving into some pretty wild claims from former President Trump.
Yeah.
He's saying he talked to Putin about ending the war in Ukraine,
Hmm.
which would be, like, huge, Yuji.
Yeah, if true, it would be the first time a U.S. president's spoken to Putin since early 2022.
Right. Like, everyone's been so careful, no direct contact. But Trump's over here saying, yeah, we chatted, and I've got a peace plan.
Of course, he's being super vague about the details.
Oh, totally. Just adding to the mystery.
Well, the ace Trump we're talking about.
True enough. But before we get into whether any of this is even believable,
Right.
you've got to remember Trump and Putin, they've got this whole history, complicated one, right?
Yeah, their interactions have always been interesting, to say the least. Public praise, then private dealings. Nobody's quite sure what went on.
Some people even say Putin saw Trump as someone he could, like, manipulate.
That Trump was a wild card he could use to his advantage.
Okay, so that's the backstory. But what about NOW? This potential conversation, if it even happened. What's it telling us about what's going on right now?
Well, the Kremlin's response, or lack of response, is pretty telling.
Oh,
They
no.
won't confirm or deny the call. They're just saying they communicate through various channels.
Classic Kremlin.
Textbook ambiguity. It keeps everyone guessing, lets them control the narrative.
So it's all a big game of chess.
You could say that. Putin is a master strategist. He loves chaos and uncertainty. This just adds fuel to the fire.
And maybe drives a wedge between the U.S. and its allies.
Possibly, yeah. But wouldn't acknowledging a conversation with Trump, even if it was about peace, give Putin some legitimacy after everything that's happened?
That's a good point.
Putin's in a tough spot. Wants to seem open to dialogue, but not weak, not desperate. He's framed this whole war as Russia's fight for survival against the West.
Right, right.
Talking peace with Trump undermines that whole narrative.
So he wants to have his cake and eat it too.
Pretty much.
Okay.
And we can't forget about his image at home. Admitting to talking to Trump could make him look weak to his own people.
Okay, so lots of strategic maneuvering going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But back to Trump's supposed peace plan.
Yeah.
Is there any reason to think he's actually got one? Or is this just typical Trump, talking big?
Well, you have to look at how Trump's handled things on the world stage before. He always preferred that personal touch, one-on-one, no diplomats, just him and the other leader.
Oh, like when he met with Kim Jong-un.
Exactly. Those situations, he relied on his deal-making skills, trying to force an agreement through sheer personality.
But did that really work? Did he actually achieve anything?
It's debatable. Some say his style opened up new possibilities for dialogue. Others say he lacked follow-through, always focused on the short-term wins, not the long game.
So is he really trying to broker peace here?
Mhm.
Or just trying to stay relevant, get back in the spotlight?
Probably a little of both. Trump loves attention, and what better way to get it than to position himself as the guy who can end this awful war?
But even if he eyed is serious, what can he do? He's not president anymore.
That's the big question. He might have Putin's ear, but he doesn't have the power of the U.S. government behind him. Any deal he makes would need Biden's approval.
And that seems pretty unlikely, right? Given how bad things are between the U.S. and Russia.
Exactly. And then there's Ukraine. They've said it loud and clear. No peace deal that compromises their territory, their independence. They want a seat at the table, not to be someone else's bargaining chip.
So we've got Trump making claims, Putin being all mysterious, and Ukraine standing firm. It's messy.
To say the least. That's why we're doing this deep dive, right? Untangling it all, figuring out what each player wants, and what it means for the future of this whole conflict.
Exactly. And for our listener, we're going to try to break this all down, make sense of the competing narratives, and help you understand what this all means for this war, which, let's be honest, affects us all.
Absolutely. In a situation this complex, with so much at stake and so much misinformation flying around, it's vital to think critically.
Challenge assumptions, look at things from all sides.
Ex-
Okay, so we've kind of set the scene, introduced the main players and their motivations, but now we need to go deeper. Are peace talks even realistic? What are the biggest roadblocks? And who else might get involved?
Right, because this isn't just about Russia and Ukraine anymore.
We'll unpack all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
So picking up where we left off, let's talk about the chances of these peace talks actually happening. We've got reports of a possible summit between Trump and Putin, maybe in Saudi Arabia, maybe the UAE.
Yeah, and at the same time, all these U.S. officials are heading to Europe to talk about the war. Lots of activity, but does it actually mean anything?
Well, talking about peace is one thing. Actually making it happen, that's a whole different story.
Because everyone wants different things, right?
Exactly. Everyone's got their own idea of what peace looks like, their own lines in the sand.
So, like, for Putin, what would he consider a win?
Well, probably Ukraine giving up on joining NATO, accepting that those annexed territories are gone, basically.
And for Ukraine and the West, that's a huge GE ask.
Yeah, it would feel like giving Putin everything he wants, rewarding him for invading.
So how do you even start to bridge that gap? Are there any, like, historical examples we can look to?
Actually, yeah. Think about the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they hated each other, totally different ideologies, but they managed to negotiate arms control treaties.
How'd they do that?
They focused on shared interests.
Yeah.
Like, nobody wants nuclear war, right?
Makes sense. Find the common ground, even if it's small.
The problem is, with Ukraine, those common goals are hard to see. Putin wants security guarantees for Russia. Ukraine wants their country back. Those seem pretty incompatible.
Like they're speaking different languages.
Totally. And that's where a good mediator could be key. Someone who can translate, build trust, find that tiny bit of common ground.
But who could do that?
Yeah.
We're talking about Putin, Zelensky, all these powerful countries. It'd take a real diplomatic rock star.
It would. Some people say China might be a good fit. They're close with Russia, but they don't want to upset the West either.
Tricky position. Okay, but let's say everyone gets to the table. What are the biggest problems they'd have to solve?
Well, there's the territory issue, which we talked about. Putin wants those annexed areas recognized as part of Russia. Ukraine says, no way.
That's a tough one.
And then NATO. Putin sees Ukraine joining NATO as a direct threat to Russia. Ukraine says it's their right to choose their allies.
So it's not even just about Ukraine anymore. It's about the whole power balance in Europe between Russia and the West. Are there any compromises that might work for everyone? Or is this just going to be a diplomatic dead end?
Well, some people have talked about this Finlandization model for Ukraine.
Finlandization? What's that?
Basically, Ukraine would stay neutral,
Yeah.
no NATO, but still independent, like a buffer between Russia and the West.
But would that satisfy everyone?
Putin might want more, like limits on Ukraine's military. Ukraine might not trust that Russia won't invade again later.
And wouldn't that set a bad example? Like, any powerful country can just take what they want by force.
That's the argument against appeasement, yeah.
Okay.
It could make things even more unstable in the long run.
Okay, so lots of potential problems.
Sure.
But let's talk about Ukraine for a minute.
Okay.
We've focused on what Putin wants, what the West wants.
Right.
What about Ukraine? What do they want?
Yeah, it's easy to forget that they're not just bystanders in this. They're fighting for their lives, their country. They deserve a say in what peace looks like.
And they've been incredibly tough, resisting Russia way longer than anyone expected.
Absolutely. They've shown the world they're not giving up. And that's had a huge impact, not just on the battlefield, but also on, like, the global stage.
Because it's not just about land anymore. It's about, like, values, right?
Mhm.
Democracy versus authoritarianism.
Exactly. So Ukraine's voice is important in all this. They're not just fighting for themselves. They're fighting for the idea that countries can choose their own future.
So how can they make sure they're heard? What leverage do they have against these bigger powers?
Well, the West has been supporting them like crazy, with weapons, with money.
So they can threaten to stop cooperating if they feel like they're being ignored.
Yeah, and there's also this moral authority they've gained. The world has seen how brutal Russia's been, attacking civilians, committing war crimes.
So it's a mix of hard power with the military aid and this kind of soft power, the moral argument.
Exactly. And that combo has been really effective, getting global support for Ukraine and making Russia look bad.
But they're still up against Russia, and Russia's huge EE.
True. So they need a smart strategy. Keep fighting, show they're not giving up, but also be smart about diplomacy, build alliances with other countries that support them.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is incredibly tough. It shows how strong the Ukrainian people are, that they can do both at the same time. So we've talked about peace talks, we've talked about what each side wants.
Right.
But there's another big piece here, the rest of the world. This conflict is impacting everyone, so other countries are watching closely.
Yeah, it's not just a local fight anymore.
It's global. The war is affecting energy prices, food supplies, international relationships. It's all connected.
So we need to understand how other countries are reacting, especially the big players.
Like China, for example. They've been cautious, expressing concern, but not condemning Russia.
They're playing it safe.
Yeah, they've got economic ties with Russia, but they don't want to make the West angry.
So what they do next is a big deal?
Huge. They could help Russia more, which would make the war worse. Or they could pressure Putin to negotiate. They could even try to be a mediator.
So many possibilities.
And it's not just China. Lots of countries, especially in the global south, are hurting because of this war. Their voices matter too.
Because the war is making inequality worse, affecting food, energy, trade. It reminds us how interconnected we all are. What powerful countries do affects everyone.
Absolutely. So finding a solution to this conflict can't just be about what a few big countries want. It has to work for everyone involved.
Lots to think about.
It is. But even with all this complexity, there's reason to be hopeful. World leaders are talking, which means they know they need to find a solution.
Right. Even if those early talks don't work out, at least they're talking.
And don't underestimate the power of people speaking out. The longer the war goes on, the more people will demand peace. Leaders have to listen to that.
Okay, so we've looked at the possibilities for peace, the role of other countries. But what happens if it all falls apart, if the fighting gets worse? Okay, so we've talked about peace talks, escalation, the rest of the world getting involved. But even after all that, what really sticks with me is just how uncertain everything still is.
Yeah.
So many things could happen. It's almost overwhelming.
It's true. Things are changing so fast, it can be hard to keep up. But I think instead of getting stuck on that uncertainty, we can use it to our advantage.
What do you mean?
Well, it forces us to step back, look at the information we have, VE, and think about what might happen next, T.
So not what if this happens, but okay, based on what we know, what are the most likely scenarios? And how can we be ready for them?
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting. When you start thinking about those scenarios, you see the choices each player has to make. Russia, Ukraine, the US, China, even the countries trying to stay neutral.
So like we're playing what if,
Yeah.
but on a global scale.
Kind of, yeah. So what are some of the paths you see things going down?
All right, let's do it.
Well, one possibility is that these diplomatic efforts everyone's talking about, they actually lead to something. Like a ceasefire agreement, then real negotiations.
That would take a lot of compromise from both sides.
It would, but it's not impossible, especially if the war just gets too expensive.
Expensive in terms of lives lost, but also all the economic damage.
Exactly. The longer it drags on, the more pressure there'll be to find a peaceful solution, both from inside those countries and from the rest of the world.
But even if they stop shooting, actually building peace would take a long time.
Right. You've still got those core issues, the territory, the security guarantees, how Russia and the West are going to interact in the future. Those problems aren't going away easily.
It's like you need to not just stop the fighting, but change the whole situation that caused it in the first place.
That's the goal, yeah. But of course, the other possibility is that diplomacy fails. The fighting gets worse, spreads to other countries.
That's the really scary one, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not something we can just ignore. If that happens, things could get really bad, really fast. Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but globally.
Because then it's not a regional conflict anymore. It could pull in NATO, maybe even, I hate to even say it, nuclear weapons.
It's a terrifying thought, but we have to acknowledge it's a possibility. That's why it's so important to be prepared, have plans in place, and really think through what could happen with every move we make.
So we're talking about decisions that could change the course of history, basically.
No pressure, right. But it also means we're not just sitting back and watching this happen. We all have a role to play in shaping the future, whether it's through the choices we make every day, getting involved in our communities, or demanding better from our leaders.
Because peace isn't some magical thing that just appears. It takes work. It takes commitment.
It takes believing in a world where people can talk things out, work together, understand each other.
Well said. So, for everyone listening, stay informed, stay involved, and don't lose sight of that hope for a better future.
That's the most important thing. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this has helped you make sense of this incredibly complex situation.
And that it's giving you some things to think about as you follow this story. Because it's not over yet. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a future where peace wins out.
Exactly. Until next time.